Good afternoon and bienvenidos. I am Elizabeth Alexander, president of the Mellon Foundation, and I am so excited to welcome you and to prepare to join in this conversation, Puerto Rico Now! Exclamation point on both sides. We'll be conducting our discussion this afternoon in English, but as you noticed when you registered for the program, there is also live Spanish and ASL interpretation and captioning available. So if you would like a link to watch those streams, please email events@mellon.org. We would love for you to say hola in the chat and to share where you're watching from. I see this chat is just streaming with folks from all over the place. Littleton, Colorado, Washington, D.C., Guayamo, Puerto Rico. People are all over the Bronx, Harlem. People are downtown Brooklyn. People are joining us from all over, which is really a wonderful thing. And we hope to see lots of, I no doubt we will have lots of audience engagement in the chat. And we'll turn to audience Q&A at the end of the discussion. So it's now my great pleasure to formally introduce our event, beginning by saying what you already know, what brought you here. Puerto Rico is a vibrant, varied, multivocal, culturally exquisite, ferocious, beautiful, mighty place that raises powerful questions about so many of the challenges we collectively face in the turbulent 21st century, and will offer us also insights for how we might work to resolve some of those challenges, especially through the arts, culture, and humanities. For decades, I have had personally an abiding interest and devotion to the people, culture, and history of La Isla and its diaspora. As someone born to Harlemites in Harlem, USA, infused with Nuyorican culture and soul and spirit that are a precious part of my heart. When I joined Mellon as its president in 2018, one of the first steps I took, my first initiative, was creating the foundation's Puerto Rico initiative. And undertaking that work has meant a deeply rewarding learning and listening process for all of us at Mellon. In that time, since 2018, we've convened and collaborated with dozens and dozens of artists, scholars, funders, educators, and other leaders from across Puerto Rico and the diaspora. We've engaged in intensive research and discovery, built meaningful relationships, and had powerful conversations about place and purpose. We bring the same commitment to large institutions as to smaller community organizations and support those who have not had access to U.S. national funders. Together with our partners in this work, we have tried to shape a holistic initiative that's rooted in a steadfast and long-term dedication to Puerto Rico's dynamic arts, culture, and humanities sectors. So as leading funders in such work in Puerto Rico and the diaspora, Mellon has made over 30 grants totaling more than $25 million since 2018, and are excited to continue this support in years to come. Before we begin our conversation, I want to just touch on a couple of key points. Today, I will use the term continental U.S. and 50 states rather than mainland when referring to the United States. I will refer to Puerto Rico both as the island and the archipelago, maybe La Isla sometimes, in recognition of the fact that Puerto Rico is in fact composed of many islands. And all of these terms, as we know, but saying for the entire audience, carry political weight and power dynamics that remain unresolved. And for that same reason, you have already heard me reference and will continue to hear me talk about the diaspora. And this is very intentional and very key to the way at Mellon that we think about Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricanness. There are currently about 6 million Puerto Ricans living across the 50 states and about 3 million Puerto Ricans living across the archipelago, many in continual motion and flow. And so we're very, very interested in what issues that brings up and about the internal diversity within that flow. We are also interested in conceptions of and conversations about race in Puerto Rico, many and varied, different on the island, in the diaspora, throughout the continental United States, and from living room to living room. Finally, there are still existing colonial dynamics that we acknowledge and remain vigilant not to replicate further. So joining us today to discuss Puerto Rico Now are our three amazing guests: Alana Casanova-Burgess, Dr. Yarimar Bonilla, and Danielle Lind-Ramos. Alana Casanova-Burgess is host and producer of the critically acclaimed podcast La Brega, Stories of the Puerto Rican Experience. Her award-winning audio journalism includes reporting for NYC on the media, and Blind Spot, Tulsa Burning, for which she and her colleagues were honored with the DuPont Columbia University Award. Her work has been featured in outlets as varied as The Guardian, The New Yorker, Radio Hour, and Latino USA. Dr. Yarimar Bonilla is a political anthropologist, professor, writer, and director of the Center for Puerto Rican Studies at Hunter College. Both an accomplished scholar and a prominent public intellectual who lends her voice so often to mainstream media, which is so helpful to educating people about our issues. Yarimar is a leading voice on questions of Caribbean and Latinx politics and of sovereignty, citizenship, and race across the Americas. She's the author of Non-Sovereign Futures, French Caribbean Politics in the Wake of Disenchantment, and with Marisol Lebron, Aftershocks of Disaster, Puerto Rico Before and After the Storm. Her current book project, for which she was named a 2018 Carnegie Fellow, examines the politics of recovery in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria and the forms of political and social trauma that the storm revealed. And Danielle Lind-Ramos, who is joining us from Museo de Arte Contemporáneo in Puerto Rico, is one of our very great contemporary artists today. He is a renowned sculptor and painter who transforms everyday objects into sculptural assemblages that embody the social history, religious rituals, and built and natural environments of his Afro-Puerto Rican community. Danielle's work has been exhibited in solo and group exhibitions at venues including the Museo de Arte de Puerto Rico, the Whitney, the National Gallery, and the Grand Palais. He is a retired senior professor from the University of Puerto Rico, Humacao campus, and among his many awards and fellowships, he received a MacArthur Genius Award in 2021. Alana, Yarimar, and Danielle, we thank you for joining us and we welcome you. Thank you. And again, these comments are so wonderful. An all-star panel. I certainly agree. So we're going to open with, a big and beautiful question that I hope you will take in all of its breadth. What is Puerto Ricanness for you? And how are you exploring that in your work? Who would like to start? Okay, well, Alana.
I'll jump in. Okay, Alana should go. Definitely.
No, I could see you were on it, Yari.
Yeah. Well, I was gonna say Alana made a whole podcast about what is Puerto Ricanness, right? I think a big part of what Puerto Ricanness is La Brega, is the struggle, right? I think for me as a political anthropologist, what I've had to focus on more is less what is Puerto Ricanness, but really what is Puerto Rico as a kind of political unit, as a polity. And I think that part of what defines what is Puerto Ricanness is the constant search to answer that question of what is Puerto Rico. Is it a colony? Is it not? For some people, it's not. For some people, it had been decolonized in the 1950s, although more and more since the debt crisis and the recent Supreme Court cases, a lot more people agree that it's a colony, and there is a lot more agreement on its need for decolonization. Is it a territory? What does that mean? Is it in the territorial clause for legal scholars? That's like really important. And I think for myself, growing up, having come of age politically and intellectually in the 1990s, it was a moment where we were trying to think also the difference between a nation politically and a nation culturally. And so I think part of what a lot of people have also been thinking about is, okay, aside from these questions of politically, are we a colony, are we a territory, are we decolonized or not, are we also a nation? And if so, what are the bounds of that nation? I love that you started the webinar by making space for talking about the archipelago and the kind of the need to move across terms, to move from isla to archipelago, diasporic communities, etc., because we are this kind of decentralized community that is tethered to a motherland in many ways, but not completely bound to that motherland.
Thank you.
I'll tap in. I'll
Please.
tap in now. So yes, it is La Brega, the struggle, right? The way that we have to find creative solutions around things. But now everything is about a vibe, right? We're all talking about vibes in 2022. And I think that the vibe around Puerto Rico in my work, and I'm glad that I don't have to be really figuring out what Puerto Ricanness is on my own, because I work on this team where all these different ways of being Puerto Rican are represented. But we think a lot about nostalgia as a vibe to Puerto Ricanness. You know, we poke at this, I poke at this a lot in my reporting, is that we are constantly yearning for something, right? For people of the diaspora like myself who were born in the US, there's this yearning for this idea of a Puerto Rico that we actually we're not born in. For people of my mother's generation who grew up there and came here later in life, there's this yearning for home that's just very nostalgic as well. Ideas on the island about history and sort of what were the glory days. Were those glory days there? Do we consider the history with rose-colored glasses? And then also this yearning for the future, I think, is really interesting. It's something that we're thinking about a lot on the team with La Brega. Like, what is a better vision that we could be imagining for the future of Puerto Rico? And there's a sort of nostalgia in that as well, although nostalgia is obviously a vibe about the past. Use that word vibe again, but it's all very bittersweet. And so I think about that in terms of defining what Puerto Ricanness is to me. You know, there's no handbook for it, obviously.
Thank you.
For me,
Daniel.
for me, being Puerto Rican, Puerto Ricanness has something to do with a strong sense of belongingness, and that belongingness is based on shared stories, shared experience, shared culture. And when I'm talking about shared stories, of course, I am talking about the political story of Puerto Rico and its relationship with the United States. Of course, I'm talking about Puerto Rico as a territory, as a colony of the United States. But at the end, is that strong sense of belongingness.
And I wonder, just for everybody, as a follow-up, if there were a word, a phrase, a sense, an image, a sentimiento, what would you say? How would you encapsulate, to pick one thing?
I'm going to pick La Brega.
Okay.
Fair.
Oh, man. La
You
Brega.
got to jump in
Alana,
there,
you
Alana.
steal
You
back.
got to be quick.
Yeah. I'll go with that sense of nostalgia of wanting. Yeah.
I would say,
also like, yeah, Daniel, go ahead.
No, I would say Puerto Rico, nombre al pensamiento grato. Will you translate that, please?
Nombre a
Puerto Rico.
pensamiento.
Puerto Rico, nombre al pensamiento grato.
Name of a thought that is pleasurable, that is delightful. Yes, I like that a lot.
Yes, like,
yes.
Beautiful.
But you know, I think Alana was also getting at something at this striving too, this desire. I think also Puerto Ricanness is also about this desire for something that a nostalgia for something we've never had, in a way, for this dream deferred. I mean, in the diaspora, you feel it most strongly. The classical song of the diaspora, Mi Viejo San Juan, where the lyrics say, maybe I'll come back, I hope I'll come back. There's this constant idea of return, which is in many ways an impossible return because you can never really go back, right? And I think even for people in Puerto Rico also, there's this desire for what we could be. We think that we have so much potential. We think our best assets are our people, our community. And I think a lot of Puerto Ricans feel that we've never been able to really live up to that full potential. That be it politics, economics, different things have held us back from really fulfilling all that we could possibly be. And I think there's still a kind of yearning for that full potential realized.
Beautiful. Let's talk about place and thinking about yourselves in the context of place, the island, the diaspora. Could you share with us a specific place that deeply influences your work, and what are some of the memories and textures and meanings that you associate with that particular place?
I feel like Yarimar and I are now playing Jeopardy. Is there a buzzer that we can hit really quickly? I will jump in and say Levittown, which is a suburb of San Juan. In the first season of La Brega, for those who haven't heard it, it's a narrative podcast, so it's very produced and reported. We take listeners to Levittown, which is maybe like 30 minutes outside of San Juan. If anyone here has heard of the first American suburb, Levittown on Long Island, this was built by the same company, Lovett and Sons. My grandparents moved back to Levittown from the Bronx in the 70s as a lot of Puerto Ricans returning to the island moved there because it had this familiarity to them. It had this cachet, this middle-class dream. And people imagine, Yari mentioned En Mi Viejo San Juan. I think people in the sort of imagination of what Puerto Rico looks like, El Viejo San Juan comes up, right? We imagine that is what Puerto Rico looks like, or it's a beach or something like that. And yes, it is those places, and Puerto Rican history does take place there. But to me, Puerto Rico looks like an American suburb in many ways. But it looks like an American suburb where Puerto Ricanness asserts itself, where people are still flying the Puerto Rican flag, where, there's a detail in that piece where land crabs, because Levittown was built on a filled-in swamp, so land crabs would continually get into the washing machines and clatter around in there. And so you have this sense of like Puerto Ricanness asserting itself even in this most American of landscapes. And I love that. And I love the sense that, you can go to Marshall's, another quintessentially Puerto Rican place, and you can see Bomba y Plena. I love this sense that Puerto Rico is always making itself known, even in these places that we don't expect it to be. People might be surprised that Marshall's is so Puerto Rican, but I don't think I've ever been to Puerto Rico and not gone into a Marshall's.
Yeah, I love that. I have a friend who jokes that in Puerto Rico, all these like chains that in the U.S. are no longer popular are very popular. Like, one of the places you'll find the most Puerto Rican food is like at El Sizzler, like at the Sizzler buffet. They'll have like rice with sausages and all these kind of traditional Puerto Rican foods. Because in many ways, I mean, Puerto Rican is about creolization. It's about, taking all this colonial input that we've had from both the Spanish colonialism and the U.S. colonialism, and transforming it, and making our own culture through those elements. But I have to say, for me, I thought about this question of the place that has most impacted my thinking about Puerto Rico, and is actually Chicago. And shout out to the folks in Chicago. I know some of them are watching. For me, that's where I discovered what diaspora meant, because I grew up in the va-y-ven, in the coming and going. I was born in Puerto Rico, but lived, went to first grade and grew up in Kansas, in Topeka, Kansas, where there wasn't a strong diasporic community. It was just kind of my family and their church group, and then I lived in Arizona. I lived in all different places where there were Puerto Ricans, but there wasn't a sense of community in the way that I experienced in Chicago. And so I don't know if people know, like, the largest monument to a flag in the world is in Chicago, and it's the Puerto Rican flag that sits on Paseo Boricua on Division Street. And there is a community there that is for 50 years now has been holding strong against colonization, against gentrification, against the attempt to erase our history, against the attempt to impose assimilation. And they've been reinventing what that Puerto Rican nation can mean, what that idea of the nation that is not tied to a state, what that can mean from outside the boundaries of the homeland, while still very much working towards the homeland and being deeply invested in what happens in that homeland. So when I was a graduate student at the University of Chicago, every Thursday I would leave Hyde Park and go to Humboldt Park and hang out with the folks there. And for me, the textures, the memories that come back is the feeling. And for a while, I lived on California Avenue, where I could see the flag right from outside my door. And I would walk out and I would feel like I was in a small town in Puerto Rico. Everyone was like walking down the street with salsa music playing. Everyone knew each other because it was also about really kind of keeping a community together that was being displaced because of gentrification of the west side of Chicago. And so that feeling of communityness and of being connected and of trying to build something together, I think maybe because in Puerto Rico, I've lived in San Juan, so I've not had the small town experience in Puerto Rico. The closest I've come to living in a small town is on the west side of Chicago, and I adored it.
Yeah. In my case, of course, Loíza, the community of Loíza, my family, my friends, the traditions, a lot of aspects of that culture obviously have formed me. And lately in my life, all of those experiences have been coming to my images. So, Loíza, I have to tell, of course.
And just to say more, because I was fortunate enough when we first met to sit with you on that main street in Loíza in your space, and hearing some about your mother, your grandmother, kids in the neighborhood, and a whole cultural way of being in the community that you were, trying to nourish as it reflected the way that you grew up. Could you talk more about that, about your space and what you're trying to do now?
Of course, when I was a child, I was lucky to live near Castor Ayala. Castor Ayala was a mask maker, among other things, very well known in Puerto Rico. And the beautiful thing is that Castor Ayala gave us jobs to do. And all of those jobs were related with the pantry, right? So for us, living in Loíza at that time, we were almost living under a palm tree. And the products from the palm tree, we used to use them not only for making crafts and art, but also to construct houses and to make food. So there were a lot of activities related with the palm tree. Palm tree, I would say, was identity. By the way, when I used to play baseball, the team was named Cocoteros de Loíza. So what I'm trying to say is that there were a lot of cultural activities in my community, and it was beautiful. The first time that I saw brushes and pigment for painting, it was in my house. Because in my house, my mother was a craft maker, my grandmother was a sewer, my uncle was a cabinet maker, and my younger uncle was a mask maker. So I saw all of those activities in my house, and I started painting in my house. And then the products that I lately developed or made, I used to carry them to Castor Ayala, because Castor Ayala gathered all of those products from the community and take them to Old San Juan to be sold. So every Monday, we wait, because he will be bringing money for us. So it was like a beautiful formation, early formation for me as an artist. And I remember that Castor Ayala's atelier, workshop, was full of different products, different pieces of works made of the products of the palm trees, but also he used to paint a lot too. And my first experience with a Garita de San Juan was in one of those paintings, So for me, that's years of formation, I would say, in Loíza were great and beautiful. And later on, as I said before, I started to incorporate the memory of those activities in what I am doing right now.
Thank you so much. To some individual questions about your work. Alana, the two versions of La Brega, one in English and one in Spanish, are not straight translations. They are each their own things, their own podcasts in terms of conversations, perspectives, and histories that you're exploring. Incredibly interesting. Could you talk some more about that?
Absolutely. Yeah, we call them bespoke translations. They're not exact. So we do change anecdotes. If the English episode, you hear more English and we paraphrase some of the Spanish and vice versa, although we do, we let the beautiful Puerto Rican accent breathe in both versions. We also make jokes in Spanish that we might not make in English because it's hard to explain a joke sometimes. And we did this because early on in the process of making the first season, our editor at the time made an important observation to us, which is how frustrating it is. He lives in Puerto Rico, and he observed how frustrating it is when good journalism is made in English about the island. And it's more frustrating when bad journalism is made in English. But that could we do something where the people we were interviewing would always be able to understand the work that was being made about them, and that's just incredibly important to our philosophy now. So we do these two versions. We're very careful with the words that we choose. There are some things that we explain and some things we don't. But one of the surprising elements of this project has been how much the central story is relevant for these two groups of audiences. And often we hear that listeners listen in both languages because they're curious to hear the Easter eggs of how they're different. But, a good example is that we did an episode about las carpetas, carpeteo, in the first season. So this is a practice, this is from Puerto Rican history. For decades, there was a surveillance program on the island that targeted the independence movement and anyone who was even thought to be associated with it. So when people say, cuidado, te van a carpetear, it means like, careful, they're going to surveil you. They'll make a folder about you. And the number of people who wrote to us in Spanish saying, I grew up hearing this phrase all the time, and I didn't truly understand what it meant to be carpeteado, what a carpeta was astonishing. But of course, we talk all the time about how crummy our textbooks are everywhere, right? Like the sense of history that we get in the United States is not great. The sense of colonial history that's taught in Puerto Rico is also not complete. It's barely there. And so, yes, we do these linguistic changes, but I feel like the history that we are telling is just as relevant to a Spanish-speaking audience as it is to an English-speaking one. And so we're sort of creating, this experiment in solidarity with these two versions so that the audience can be having the same conversation even in two different languages.
Thank you. And could you be a historian for us for a minute, for our, audience coming from so many different perspectives and knowledge bases? And, many people are very surprised when they learn that there are more Puerto Ricans living in the continental U.S. Than in Puerto Rico. So could you, just in a nutshell, how did this happen? But why is it relevant?
Yes. Pull up a chair. I guess we could start the story a bit in the 1940s. The historians listening might be in the chat now saying that she's not qualified. But there was this sense from the Puerto Rican government and from the US government that Puerto Rico needed to develop from an agrarian system to an industrialized system. In part, this was because Puerto Rico needed to be developed as a kind of showcase of capitalism in the Caribbean. It at a certain point needed to be considered in the same breath as Cuba, right? Cuba as a communist bastion, and Puerto Rico had to be, the U.S. pearl to show what capitalism could do. So there was the sense also that that it was sort of the the U.S. had to do something to help Puerto Ricans. They were too many of them, and they were too poor. And how could you develop an economy? I'm saying this in this sort of sarcastic voice now. I don't believe this. But how could you develop an economy with all these people, especially because an industrialized economy needs fewer people than an agrarian one? So there are too many Puerto Ricans. What do we do? And there were a number of different solutions to this problem. I say solutions in quotation marks, but there was a lot of birth control and forced and not. But there was also this idea that cities in the north, New York, Chicago, which Yarimar mentioned, needed cheap labor. And so the government, both the Puerto Rican government and the US government, created these programs to encourage migration to the US. It wasn't forced, but it was incredibly encouraged. So you had educational programs in schools where kids were taught about how great New York City was and how great it would be to speak English. You had government offices that were about helping people get employment in places like New York. And you had cheap flights. The airlines were a big part of this in order to encourage migration. And so you had this huge flow of migration to the United States. And at the same time, you had this Operation Bootstrap, Mano a la Obra, which was changing the economy of the island, of the archipelago. So the second part of your question was about why it's relevant, right? I mean, it's relevant because in some ways it's happening again today. It is incredibly difficult to live in Puerto Rico as a Puerto Rican. There's enormous gentrification. The cost of living is incredibly high. There are power outages all the time and also water outages. And the sense that Puerto Rico is becoming a playground for the rich is very present. And there's more and more evidence of policies that seek to deter Puerto Ricans from living in Puerto Rico. And I don't know if Danielle and Yari want to step in and add to the factor of relevance at this point, but yes, that is my nutshell. I hope I did it justice.
That was perfect. Thank you. Any additions?
Well, I think Alana did a beautiful job there. And I think, I'm always struck by the fact that the Puerto Rican Labor Department was the only labor department that had a migration division. I mean, that was part of the idea of how to deal with employment. And similarly, after Hurricane Maria, it was the first time that FEMA built an air bridge. That part of the policy of recovery was once again displacing folks out of their community. So I think that it's just systematically over time, displacement has been seen as a solution to Puerto Rico's problems. And it's incredibly problematic, of course.
In the chat, there's a lot of really interesting testimony from folks talking about their own family history. People whose families picked tobacco in Connecticut along the river outside of Hartford. Agricultural workers in Pennsylvania. Apple, onion, lettuce picking in upstate New York and Rochester. So there's a lot of really edifying conversation going on. Yeah.
And I would just add to what Alana was saying before about how, our textbooks fail us, both in Puerto Rico and in the United States. I often, when I teach about Puerto Rico in my classes, I always want to start by telling my students, do not feel bad that you don't know this history, because a lot of students come in and especially those who are Puerto Rican, they feel a sense of shame that they don't know their history or guilt. And I tell everyone, when they walk in the door, like, don't feel upset, but do feel angry, do kind of demand that history be known, because part of what I always like to quote this line from a very cheesy Hollywood movie that said, part of what makes the American people is what they don't know. Part of what the American people don't know is what makes them the American people, right? So U.S. history is built on silences. It's built on silencing colonialism. And if you watch any of the hearings that happen in Washington where they discuss Puerto Rico's political status, you see how even elected officials, even at the level of the Supreme Court, when you watch the deliberations or read the transcripts, you can see that even the Supreme Court justices are like, oh, what is this? because Puerto Rican history and not just Puerto Rican, but the history of the U.S. colonies, which include, of course, the U.S. Virgin Islands, Guam, Samoa, the Philippines, etc. None of that is taught in the U.S. at any moment. Not even not in primary school, middle school, high school, grad school, up into law schools. So that's one of I think something that I've been trying to push for lately is like we need to impact that and to recognize the role of colonial history in U.S. history and the role of Puerto Rican movements, including movements in New York, in Chicago, etc., as part of the history of the civil rights movement in the United States, right? And I think that that's part of what is necessary in this country to empower folks so that they're no longer asking, what is Puerto Rico? What is Puerto Ricanness? That those questions come from the complete silence around what is Puerto Rico and what is imperialism.
And we need it in Puerto Rico too.
And then just, adding in from, please. I was just going to say, adding in from the chat, cane workers in Hawaii, cane people going to work the cane fields in Hawaii, people coming to do factory work in Philadelphia and then watching those factories shut down. And also what we're seeing in the chat is more overlaying of race, and the waves of Black and brown people who came at what particular points in time, and then, as you say, Yarimar, became some of them a part of other kinds of rights movements going on in the U.S. So really, really rich and important. Yarimar, I'd love to hear from you now a little bit about contextualizing Puerto Rico and the Caribbean. And so at the end of this lesson, we will know everything. So what, island sensibilities, political realities does Puerto Rico share with other countries in the Caribbean, and what is distinct? Again, these are one of these enormous questions, but I'd love to get into this zone.
Yeah. Well, my major when I was at the University of Puerto Rico, proud alum of the UPR, was social sciences general program with a concentration in Caribbean studies. So from the moment I was an undergrad, I started to see the study of the Caribbean as the best way for me to understand Puerto Rico, because I feel like before I was really, opened up to that study of the Caribbean, I always felt that Puerto Rico was described as a Latin American nation, and in some ways we are, but in that history, there was so much that I didn't understand about our political history, etc. And when I begin to study Guadeloupe, Martinique, Curacao, all these other non-sovereign places in the Caribbean, that's when I realized, we're not this oddity, because I feel like part of what a lot of Puerto Ricans feel is a sense of shame about our political history, that we have a kind of incomplete political history because we did not follow a particular path of independence that is, again, particular. And to understand Puerto Rico is to understand that it's actually part of a larger system of non-sovereign societies and of different forms of decolonization, if one wants to imagine it that way, or of attempted decolonizations, right? So Luis Muñoz Marin, who authored, Puerto Rico's Commonwealth status, we need to understand him. We need to think about Aimé Césaire and how Aimé Césaire, one of the biggest, thinkers of decolonization, the path that he proposed and followed for Martinique was not that of independence, but of integration with France. Of course, Aimé Césaire's vision was that by becoming part of France, this would result in the decolonization of France, and that France as a nation would change and transform into a nation that it was not majority white and European, but that was a nation now scattered throughout the Caribbean, Africa, etc. So that was the vision that he had. And I think that a lot of folks in Puerto Rico, who, especially those who are interested in statehood, they need to look more at what has happened in the parts of the Caribbean that have incorporated fully into their empires, right? And how, the struggles continue in those places, because Aimé Césaire had this vision that incorporation into France would transform France, but it did not, And so I think that as we think about the future political paths of Puerto Rico, rather than this insistence on seeing Puerto Rico as the last colony or the only colony, the oldest colony. I feel like Puerto Ricans love to kind of grab onto these titles. Instead, we need to understand ourselves as part of the system of alternatively decolonized places, or whatever rubric you want to choose. Thankfully, at Centro, through the support of the Mellon, we will be focusing directly on this in our decolonization study group to better understand, like, how does our path relate to the path followed by Martinicans, Guadeloupeans, but also folks in the Philippines, folks in Guam, folks in Palau. There's now been new conversations about Puerto Rico possibly being able to become an associated republic. What in the world is that? How are those political relationships negotiated? Can we understand that as decolonization? Are those treaties negotiated on equal terms by both parties, etc.? I think there are so many questions that, for me, coming through the Caribbean and then coming back to Puerto Rico has been so important, because it allowed me to think about imperialism, colonization, decolonization, all of that outside of just Puerto Rico and the United States. And so that has helped me then understand, okay, there are, of course, many particularities about Puerto Rico, one of them being that overlay of colonial empires, where it's not just the U.S. colonialism that is present now, but that other foundation of Spanish colonialism, and how sometimes when we want to assert our difference from the U.S., what we grab onto are also colonial aspects, like Spanish language, or a lot of our kind of non-American culture is Spanish culture, so to be able to understand, like, how our approach to shopping malls and Marshalls and all these things is a form of Puerto Ricanness, we have to then kind of give up on having this authentic pre-colonial base to go back to. And that's something that all of the Caribbean has had to struggle with, right? And had to reimagine, like, what does it mean to be the product of, of course, the great, diasporic experience, which was the Middle Passage. So the entire culture of the Caribbean has been, in many ways, kind of creating on top of this colonial experience and extractive experience of plantation slavery. So I think to be able to imagine a Puerto Rican future, we have to kind of understand that Caribbean historical foundation.
Such a rich answer. Thank you so much. We're now going to have a treat and turn to looking at some of Danielle's work and talk about your artistic practice. So we have a few things that we're going to look at, and I think they will come up on the screen. Here we are. Beautiful. So we'd love to hear about each work as we turn to it, but thinking particularly, what are some of the histories that you're exploring in your work? And also, how has your own vocabulary and artistic vocabulary and use of materials evolved over the years? So another big question, but we could start with this amazing piece.
All right. Talking about history, one of my intentions is to present history to communities. Because I remember when I was in school, public school in Loíza, we didn't knew or heard a lot about our Afro history in Puerto Rico, just a few. So this piece, which is called 1797, Vencedor, has something to do with a historical fact. And that is when the England army tried to seize Puerto Rico, and it received a very strong resistance from the inhabitants of Puerto Rico by that time. But the beautiful thing is that there is a list of a black militia from Loíza with all of its names written there, right? So I said, wow, here's a document, very important to be presented to my community in Loíza. Very important fact, right? So I made different expressions related with that, especially in Piñones, where it was the place where the English Navy was saw by the first time. So this one represents the victory of Puerto Rican in general, but the participation of the black militia in that victory. That's the reason why the name of it is Vencedor. But I was thinking how I'm going to present an image related with a victory that represents us. I mean, as part of the Puerto Rican population, right? So I thought about materials that are related with our experiences. So, as I said before, that in Loíza we depend a lot. When I was a child, we depend from the pantry. So we made a lot of objects related with that. So I took that material, the pantry, to include it in this image. That's the reason why the torso of the figure and the head of the figure and part of or other parts of the figure are related with the pantry. So there, of course, I'm trying to talk about identity, right? Part of the Puerto Rican identity has to be something with Loíza, right? And there you have the machete, right? It has something to do with the victory, of course, but it's also a tool, very important tool, related again, not only with the economy around the pantry, cutting coconut, opening coconut, but also it's related with other activities, economic activities like fishing crabs. So what I tried to do here in this image was incorporate all of those experiences that I had with materials related with my community. And for example, the cap is related with some of the materials used to in the custom of Puerto Rican masquerade. You know, of course, I don't want to talk directly about that masquerade, but I want to suggest that masquerade and those elements related with that masquerade. So at the end, that's the image. It represents the victory where we are connected through our ancestors, right? It connected with the history of the Caribbean, but I try to do it in a very different way, based in autochthonal or vernacular language.
Wow. And then also, of course, there's the baseball mitt, the catcher's mitt that we see in the larger piece down at the bottom. Is that a baseball mitt?
Yes, because there is a coconut there that represents the English army. I don't know if you could identify the colors of the English army. Right.
Okay.
And because I used to play baseball and I love baseball, I always want to include my own experience, my personal experience in the image, right? So I'm related the capture of the coconut that represents the English, part of the narrative of the victory against the English army. That's the reason why that glove is there with the holding the coconut, right? Holding the coconut. And as you can see, also there are tools related with workers, workers.
Yeah. I feel like also in the shape, there's something that reminds me of West African sculpture about some of the shapes of Akan, maybe, I don't know, sculpture in there.
Yes, I had in mind a very powerful king related with that narrative, right? A king in his horse, a victory king in his horse. But right, like Shango, you're riding his horse. Well, this is not Shango, but I'm aware of those orishas. I'm aware of that spirituality in the whole Caribbean, and being from Puerto Rico, that belongs to all of us. So if I have to use it, I use it, right? I use it. But yes, if I am going to talk about victory, I go back to those images related with victory that belong to us. I mean, connected with our African ancestor, and I bring it. But I also wanted to make another figure in a horse, because in Loíza, Fiesta de Santiago are related with a saint that is riding a horse. So I wanted to have an alternative based in our history here in the Caribbean, here in Loíza. So for me, it was very important to make that sculpture related with these important facts where, again, our ancestors participate defending what they consider their place.
Yeah. Beautiful. Then there's another one that I want us to have a look at. Woo! Wow. This is
All right.
amazing. And could you start, because I see some people asking in the chat, give us a sense of scale for this piece.
That one, this one specifically,
Yeah,
is
this one
it's like
specifically.
yeah, it's like 10 feet high until the top, and almost let's say 8 feet wide. Yeah, it's a big one. Yes, and
Yeah.
it's part of yeah, it's part of a series of Marias that I started to make right after the first day that the hurricane passed. This is like the 1, 2, 3, 4 one. Yeah, and it's called Maria de los Sustentos. And I wanted to make a figure related with that knowledge, that ancestral knowledge that we use when we have a catastrophe. When electricity is not there, what are you going to do?
Mm-hmm.
So we recur, we go back to our ancestral knowledge, and we start again with fire. And I remember that after Maria, in our community, everything also, we have a situation, let's do something, let's cook. We go to the pantries that were fallen, we pick up coconuts, we pick up dry coconuts, and we started again like using burens to cook, We started like cooking outside. There was no problem because that knowledge was there. People were fishing,
Yeah.
But the figures also represent protection, but protection in terms of community, how we in a situation got together, and help each other. And those instruments, those elements, those tools are also related with the first time after the hurricane passed, that the first thing that you have to do is how to get off your house. Many of the houses are covered by trees, or you are almost until here with water. So that's the reason that those two tools that are around are related with cutting or are related with rowing, Because my experience was that I was in this house, and then after I get off the house, I have to pass through a lot of water. By the way, it was there where I found the first object that I used to start with the series of Maria. So this is Maria based on ancestral knowledge that still we need in time of catastrophe. Yeah.
Yes. Wow. Wow. And I know in some of the other pieces that have that particular blue, that you use the tarps, the roof tarps. I don't know if that's what's happening in this piece as well. In
Well,
the blue on the side and the bottom.
Well, in the side of the tools, of course, there
Yeah.
are blue tarp related with FEMA.
Yeah, it is the tarp.
Because, and with all of the intention, I want to use that material not only in the context of surviving or helping each other, but also in political terms, because FEMA is related with Puerto Rico, it's related with the political situation of Puerto Rico, and when a catastrophe comes, FEMA is there. And many people are waiting for FEMA to help, So that's the reason why sometimes I bring the materials, because it's a very charged material in terms of healing, helping. I remember that from my studio, I saw all those houses covered by the FEMA blue tarp, right?
Yeah.
And many people survive few weeks with that there, regardless of what they think, politically speaking. They use the tarp. So you have a situation there where you could present it symbolically in terms of the relationship of Puerto Rico colonial situation with the United States. So for me, it's very important to bring it.
Yes, yes. And then just the last time that I saw your work was just a month ago at the Afro-Atlantic Histories exhibition at the National Gallery in Washington, having traveled from Houston, and before that, having originated in Brazil. And so as to that context for your work, I wonder how you felt about your work in that conversation of Afro-Atlantic history, and if there is more to say about that.
Yes, of course. Regardless of our local experiences, we have a common experience, which is related with Africa and the event of slavery, and that is still somehow affecting us. That is present, right? So being there with this local expression, but still connected with that mega story of Afro-Atlantic stories, it was great because I thought that Afro-Puerto Rican experience was there represented, you know. Afro-Puerto Rican experience, what they are sharing with this image with all of those other experiences in the Atlantic. And for me, it was great. It was great. Yes.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you for this beautiful, beautiful in-depth look at your work. And that last question relates us to a question for everybody that I think is very, very interesting. In the 2020 census, the percentage of Puerto Ricans who identified as white plummeted from 76% in 2010 to just 17%. And the percentage of respondents who, the panelists know this, I'm saying this for everybody, the percentage of respondents who identified as two or more races increased from 3% in 2010 to 50%. And the percentage of people who identified as Black stayed relatively stable. So I would love a parsing of these numbers as a way of thinking about the live question of race in Puerto Rico.
Well, I'll jump in because I did write a piece about these shifting racial identities that I co-authored with my colleague Isar Godreau from University of Puerto Rico. And Isar and I, what we wrote about was how in the wake of Hurricane Maria and also in the wake of Puerto Rico's financial crisis, like we know that there is a kind of bankrupt state in Puerto Rico that no longer can afford cultural preservation, the cultural work of the Instituto de Cultura, etc., could no longer afford public works, public transportation, all these things. So what impact does that have on the racial work of the state? Because we know that part of the work of the state is to produce racial identities. And so our argument is that before the financial crisis, when Puerto Rico had its own census, the race question was omitted. And that's part of why when the race question gets put back in, Puerto Ricans are not trained to answer that question, because in the United States, we're constantly being asked, what race are you? And everywhere we go, any form we fill out. And even though those forms are always confusing and kind of nonsensical, like we've developed answers to them. And it's a training that the state has done in the United States to get us to identify and pick a box. And it's based on the one-drop rule. That is what dominates in the United States, etc. So in Puerto Rico, we didn't have that racial training to answer those questions. And so what my colleague Isar and I found, and I specifically, I worked with a group of students in Puerto Rico doing survey research, and we would ask folks at the end of the survey that was about politics and other things, the Fiscal Control Board. And then at the end, we would say, okay, well, so what's your age? What municipality are you from? And what's your racial identity? And when we would ask their racial identity, people would be stumped. They would literally have long pauses and silences and be confused and ask us, what does it say on the form? What are the boxes? Because they didn't have a quickly developed answer to that, right? But we did find that of the people who identified more quickly were those who identified as Black. So people who are dark skinned, who have been socialized as Afrodescendiente in Puerto Rico, be it through a proud family heritage or through discriminatory practices that have forced them to reflect on the color of their skin and their place in the racial hierarchy in Puerto Rico, they had a clear sense of their racial identity. They understood their Blackness. But the folks who did not quickly identify as Black, they had these long pauses, and then sometimes they would tell us that the question itself was racist, that we shouldn't be asking people their race, that they were part of the human race, which obviously echoes this kind of idea of racial democracy that exists throughout Latin America, or the kind of Latin American version of colorblindness. And so, but that was, we were seeing at the moment and we were doing it, that all of that was shifting as we were studying it. Because I think with Hurricane Maria, with the famous toss of the paper towels and all of that, Puerto Ricans realized that they were not white, or as we argue in our paper, that they are white. They're white with an asterisk. A kind of qualified whiteness is the term that Isai Godreau and I developed, to think about this idea of Latin American whiteness. And so a lot of the people who did identify as white in our survey, they would give it a kind of asterisk or a kind of adjective. So they would say they were white Puerto Rican, or they were white Latino, or they were like, well, I'm considered white here, but not there. And so they had all these folkloric answers that I think point to, first, the lack of kind of an understanding of our racial identity, which has been is increasingly changing, and we're seeing how with each census we see a further move away from whiteness in Puerto Rico, because that has been changed, and it's not just the result of U.S. federal discrimination, but also of activism of organizations like Colectivo Ile and others that have done massive campaigns to help Puerto Ricans embrace their Afro identity, their Afrodescendencia, and to identify as such on the census, and to also recognize the importance of that ritual. Because again, we didn't have racial statistics in Puerto Rico for a long time. We still don't have reliable racial statistics. And so even though some folks think that this might be a racist question, as they told us that when we ask folks to identify racially, some folks are still very hesitant to identify racially in Puerto Rico. They think that's an American thing. I think there is a growing consciousness of like, we would like to be able to say how the pandemic, the earthquakes, the hurricane, all these different crises that we've had, how have they impacted along the lines of race? We need racial data to be able to say that, right? And so more accurate racial statistics are going to help us better understand the effects of these issues on our different communities, and to have a better sense of what is our racial identity, and the different pathways that people inhabit given their racial background, which is something that in Puerto Rico for a long time has been silenced.
Thank you. Anything else to add to changing racial identification?
Well, I was going to add that Yarimar mentioned that the question is fairly new. It was actually Luis Muñoz Marin who argued that the question should be removed from the census because race just wasn't even a factor in Puerto Rican society, was his argument. And so I often think, I don't know what the conclusion is to this thought, but how Puerto Rican was a race that one could select on the census in New York, and yet racism did not exist in Puerto Rico at the same time. Like what is the story that the census tells us about Puerto Ricans in the United States as much as it tells us about racial attitudes in Puerto Rico?
Well, what I always tell my students is that there's no right or wrong way to do race. Like, race is a colonial imposition. It's a social construct. And so there's no real biological reality. And so we have to kind of start there and then understand that the census is a product of the U.S. racial state, and that it has been geared towards a particular U.S. racial ideology. And so it's not that Puerto Ricans are getting it right or wrong, is that we were socialized under a different racial ideology. And now we're trying to figure out how to utilize this tool that does allow us to tell different stories about our communities. So how to best utilize this tool that wasn't created for our racial reality.
And what I'd throw in, and we don't have time to get into all of it now, but I should have probably put, there's race, but then there's the question of color. So regardless of what we think about, racial categorization and the census, color and colorism are always issues. And I think also in diaspora, there are just fascinating questions that we touched on earlier that happen when, folks come to especially cities with Black populations, and how all of that works itself out. I think also a whole nother set of questions that's coming up in the chat that's so important that we don't have time for is to think about Indigenous identity and heritage and how that all fits in. So more conversation for more time. What I want to do now, we don't have a lot of time left, and this is a poppin' chat. So let me just, I'm going to ask some simple, quick, beautiful questions. From Edwin Rios at the City of New Haven Board of Alders. What books or documentaries does the panel strongly recommend to educate me on my Puerto Rican heritage? And then we also have a question, I will tell you in a minute who asked it, but about art and poetry. So if we could just, popcorn some quick recommendations on things that you think are would be really strong for people to have a look at, knowing that we can't cover it all. Maybe Danielle, we start with you. A poet, an artist, a documentary, a book, something you want us to look at.
Well, poets. I have friends in Loiza that are poets, and I am interested in them because they are from there, and I receive energy from there. Sadly,
Yes.
they haven't published, even though they have a lot of written poetry. That is what I could say about that.
And how would we encounter?
All right.
Come.
Yeah, you come to Loiza, and then in my house where you were, we could get together, and I have done that before.
That's
because
it.
I like to invite the community and do that. I just recently did.
Beautiful.
I invite the poets, invite the community, and they read poetry there related with our communal experience. Yeah, we do that there.
Beautiful, 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 beautiful. More recommendations.
There's a documentary called Landfall, which is very good. There's also a novel that was written. You mentioned earlier the diaspora in Hawaii, the Puerto Rican community in Hawaii. There's a novel. There's a novel called The Taste of Sugar, which is by Maricel Vera, which I finished earlier this summer, which is quite beautiful. If that's sort of it's an idea that I think we should all be more familiar with, is how there are Puerto Ricans everywhere. This is sort of an old school, but a classic recommendation of anything by Arcadio Díaz Quiñones. I keep La Memoria Rota on my desk, and like just casually, and I'm sure it's translated. It is a beautiful text about memory and Puerto Rico that I would really recommend.
Beautiful.
And La Brega.
Of course.
Yeah, I will co-sign on anything Arcadio Díaz Quiñones as an entry point to Puerto Rico and its diaspora. I think poetry. I love Tato La Viera. But maybe it's just because it was transformative for me. I still remember being at the library at the University of Puerto Rico and opening up La Carreta Made a U-Turn, book by Tato La Viera, and it just educating me on the diaspora in a way, that I had not been exposed to before. And so the creative, I think poetry, I think the New Yorican poets, but I'm biased in that regard.
Wonderful. This is from Margaret Doyle at Aliada, who asks, how can the 5th anniversary of Hurricane Maria this fall serve not only as a moment of commemoration, but also as a call for reparative and forward-looking justice?
Good question.
Yeah.
I mean, it's hard because I think in some ways the conversation around Puerto Rico has been stuck around Hurricane Maria. I mean, it opened so much attention to the island and to the archipelago and to the diaspora, and so I'm a little cautious around thinking too much even about the anniversary, but I know that even as someone who works in media, that these anniversaries are ways for us to get attention to subjects that otherwise wouldn't. But there's so much that has happened in the last 5 years. I mean, a governor was toppled. There's an electricity crisis that actually doesn't even directly have to do with the hurricane itself. It has to do more with privatization and forces that were brewing long before that. There was There's coastal erosion as well, which is a climate issue, an environmental issue, which I know has to do with the hurricane. So I'm feeling a little bit conflicted about all of that. Just to say that pinning. I also worry about what happens after the anniversary. Does all this attention, all this foundation support that has come in after the hurricane, does it evaporate? What do we do? So those were
Yeah,
all
I
just more
agree with
anxieties
Alana.
than
Yeah. At Central, we've been discussing, well, how are we going to commemorate? And some people said, is this now like a thing that we have to commemorate each year? Is this now like a national mourning holiday or something? And so some people feel that we shouldn't, but I think we need to. 5 years is 5 years. We didn't do anything big last year for the fourth year, and partly because we were in the pandemic. But I think that part of what we need to do, I know a lot of people are upset about the retelling of the same traumatic tale, and the kind of disaster porn that can lead to. But I think it was an important moment in our history that opened up entirely new political conversations, entirely new political movements. And I think the best way we can honor that and honor those we lost and all of that is to honor those who are struggling to create something new. And so I think a kind of forward-looking commemoration of like, what is the path that we've been building in the past 5 years that has been about reclaiming the land, reclaiming our space, pushing back against gentrification, pushing back against displacement, and also pushing back against the idea that it's only FEMA and its blue tarps that could save us in times of disaster, when in fact it was mostly those cacerolas, those pans that Daniel shows in his art. I think that image itself is so telling of how the tarps are such a small part of it. And it was those pans through which we fed ourselves. Then we later used them as symbols of protest to get rid of the governor. So I think that all of that celebration of that path that we've been charting towards hopefully something that's not a recovery of what was before Maria, but a reinvention of what Puerto Rico could be, I think might be the best way.
Yeah, just focusing on agency instead of, I think natural disasters bring out often the best in people, and focusing on that sense of agency and power instead of, some fictional idea of victimhood.
This question is from Lisa Oppenheim. How does tourism help or hurt Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans? And I think that's an interesting question when you think about, an undeniably beautiful and special and rich and extraordinary place. So people want to come. So how do we think about tourism as something that can help or hurt or something else? Maybe Danielle, you could start with that.
That's something that I have been thinking since so long. I wonder how much an artist, in my case, or in the case of my colleagues, adjusts their expression to please something related with tourism, At least that's the question that I have been asking, how tourism could affect personal expression. So you have to adjust what you feel, what you want to say to for selling or something, That's what I could tell right now. That's something that I constantly am thinking about. And we are also discussing with my friends, like, do you have a star in Ponce? Because Ponce is also, a place that has a masquerade, and has expression that look like the one that are celebrated in Loíza. And we are always talking about that, Are we authentic, or are we trying to, accommodate our expression related with economic, Yeah, that's my...
Thank you.
Yeah,
Anything else on tourism?
I think here again is as a place where Puerto Rico, we need to understand ourselves as part of the Caribbean. I feel like in the Caribbean, the tourism economy has been so studied. It's repercussions, because I think a lot of times in Puerto Rico tourism before Hurricane Maria and the economic crisis, some thought it was underexploited. We didn't have it wasn't as significant a part of our economy as it was in other parts of the Caribbean. And some folks think that we need to change that it needs to be a bigger part of our economy. But before making that move, we need to look at the consequences of that and how throughout the Caribbean there's such discontent with what tourism brings, especially cruise ships, which are, some of the most environmentally harmful forms of tourism that also don't have a lot of deep economic impact in the places where they touch, right? Because everything is consumed and spent on the ship. But also the creation of resorts and the emphasis on the visitor economy instead of the resident economy. And so when everything becomes, like Danielle is saying, focused around what can you sell to tourists and what is the version of Puerto Rico that tourists wants to see, and how can we build, roads to tourist attractions and all these things, you're then not thinking, well, what do we need? Where do we need the roads? What are the places that are culturally and historically significant to us rather than to the outside world, right? So I think and we have lessons to learn from the mistakes of the Caribbean and also from the places where tourism has been done a different way. And also places, not just in the Caribbean, but also in Europe, where they're also sounding the alarm of over emphasis on tourism and the impact that it can have on historical places. So I think to imagine instead, like, how can we make Puerto Rico an amazing place for those who live and those who visit, right? So I think if Puerto Rico is somewhere that the people who live there can enjoy, can have access to parks, to beaches, to live music, to the cultural offerings of a vibrant society, that's going to be a place that other people are going to want to visit, right? Rather than packaging something for the outside without thinking about our own enjoyment.
But for those who are watching, sorry, do we have time for
No,
one
please.
tiny?
A quickie, yeah.
For those who are watching this and listening to us and thinking about going to Puerto Rico, maybe they're not Puerto Rican themselves, just doing research around the impact that Airbnb is having, for example, in some neighborhoods in San Juan. And I'm very much in a self-reflection mode around this as well. I am guilty, for I too have sinned, but these Airbnbs are displacing a lot of housing stock that would otherwise be used for people living in Santurce, people living in neighborhoods of San Juan and all over the island, really. So thinking about where it is that you want to put your dollars, do you want to support a locally run hotel where that money is going to stay in a community? Asking yourselves those questions. And I promise I will ask them of myself as well.
But obviously, this isn't solved through individual action.
No.
It has to be a public policy issue. No, because I think there's no way out in a way, because there's a lot of people who have gone into debt to set up Airbnbs. So the Airbnb economy, the damage it's had is already there, and it needs to be limited through kind of government policy and not just individual choices. Because right now the game is rigged. There's kind of no pure, clean choices if you are, going to Puerto Rico. I always just say tip well. That's what
I say. So we've gone over, and we could keep talking and talking, but all beautiful things must not come to an end, but rather a little pause. So we're going to have to close our conversation now, but I want to thank each of you so very much for all that you brought to this conversation, to the knowledge and the creativity and the belief and the spirit. Thank you so very, very much. To all of the people having such an alive conversation in the chat. Thank you also from so many places for being an active part of this. This was beautiful. I learned so much. And so Yarimar, Alana, Danielle, muchísimas gracias, mi corazón a tuyos, and to everybody else, to the next conversation. Thank you.